I always thought my marriage to Sarah was unbreakable. We'd been together for 12 years, married for 8, and while no relationship is perfect, I believed ours was solid. She was my best friend, my partner, the person who made life's mundane routines feel special. But over the past 6 months, something felt off. It started subtly. Sarah became increasingly guarded with her phone, keeping it face down on the table, excusing herself to another room when she received a text. She'd recently started staying late at work more often than usual, blaming a demanding new boss. I chalked it up to stress and tried to be supportive. Then there were the little things. She started wearing perfume to work, even though she'd always been too casual for that. There were new clothes in her closet, dresses and heels more suited to a date night than her usual office attire. When I asked her about them, she smiled and said, "I just felt like treating myself." I wanted to believe her, but the excuses piled up. She started spending weekends out, claiming she was catching up with friends I'd never met. She came home smelling like expensive cologne, and when I mentioned it, she laughed it off, saying her friends hugged her goodbye. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her. I didn't want to be that husband, the paranoid, possessive one who imagines things. Instead, I tried to rationalize it all. Maybe I was just insecure. Maybe it was all in my head. It wasn't until one Saturday afternoon, when Sarah left in a rush to meet Mia for brunch, that I finally decided I couldn't ignore the feeling any longer. I had no idea that decision would unravel my life. That Saturday, after Sarah left for her so-called brunch, I decided to do something I'd never done before. Check her location on the Find My Phone app we'd set up years ago. I hated the idea. Felt invasive, but my gut told me I needed to know. Her location popped up immediately. She wasn't at a restaurant or a cafe. She was in the suburbs, in a quiet, upscale neighborhood we had no ties to. Something didn't add up. I told myself I'd just drive by, take a look, and if everything seemed fine, I'd leave. No confrontation, no accusations, just closure for my nagging doubts. When I arrived, I parked a few houses down and scanned the street. It was a row of pristine homes, the kind with manicured lawns and shiny SUVs parked in the driveway. Sarah's car was in front of a white brick house with a bold red door. I sat there for what felt like forever, debating whether to leave or stay. Then, as if fate wanted to twist the knife, the door opened. Sarah stepped out, laughing. She wasn't alone. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, followed her. He had his arm draped casually around her waist, and she leaned into him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Couldn't breathe. They walked to his car, a sleek black sedan, and got in together. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard they hurt. My heart raced and my mind spiraled. Who was he? What the hell was going on? I tailed them, keeping a safe distance. They drove across town and stopped at a luxury hotel. My stomach churned as I watched them walk inside, hand in hand. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was real. My wife was cheating on me, but I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed to know more, everything. I sat in my car outside the hotel for hours, battling waves of anger and disbelief. I needed proof. If I confronted Sarah without evidence, she'd deny it, twist it, make me doubt myself. No, this time I needed to be sure. I left the hotel and went home, my mind spinning. That night, Sarah came home late, looking disheveled but cheerful. "Mia and I lost track of time," she said, dropping her purse on the counter and kissing my cheek like nothing was wrong. The smell of cologne clung to her, faint but undeniable. The next morning, I made a plan. I reached out to a friend of mine, Dave, who worked in IT. I told him I needed help with something personal and didn't go into details. Dave was the kind of guy who loved a challenge, and within a day, he'd installed a discreet tracking app on Sarah's phone while she was in the shower. "This will log her messages, calls, and locations," he said. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I wasn't sure about anything anymore, but I nodded. The app worked better than I expected and worse than I feared. Over the next week, I uncovered a storm of deceit. There were texts from the man whose name was Eric. They weren't vague or ambiguous. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was incredible. You looked so sexy in that red dress. My stomach turned every time I read his words. Worse, Sarah's responses were equally explicit. She even lied about me, calling me boring and predictable. As the days passed, I noticed a pattern. Sarah wasn't just sneaking around. She was spending our money on gifts for Eric. Expensive cologne, designer ties, even a watch I'd once admired in a store window. She'd bought it for him. I wanted to confront her, to scream at her, to demand answers. But something inside me told me to wait. I wanted to know just how deep this betrayal went. Then, I stumbled on something that made my blood run cold. A confirmation email for a reservation. Sarah and Eric were planning to attend a private event at an exclusive club downtown. The event was 3 days away. I decided I'd follow her there. I didn't know it yet, but that night would change everything. The night of the event, Sarah left the house dressed to the nines. A black gown hugged her curves, and she wore heels I'd never seen before. She kissed me on the cheek and said, "Work dinner. Don't wait up." I forced a smile and watched her walk out the door, my blood boiling. I followed her to the address from the email, a private club tucked away in the heart of downtown. The kind of place where memberships cost more than some people's yearly salaries. I parked down the block and waited. She stepped out of her car and into Eric's waiting arms. He kissed her on the lips, lingering as if he had every right to. I clenched my fists, but I didn't move. Not yet. They went inside, and I waited a full 10 minutes before walking toward the entrance. A well-dressed bouncer stopped me, eyeing my casual attire. "Private event," he said curtly. "I'm here for Sarah Daniels," I said, forcing calm into my voice. He hesitated, then checked his list and nodded. "Go ahead." Inside, the club was dimly lit and extravagant. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and soft jazz played in the background. I scanned the room until I found them. Sarah and Eric, seated at a corner table, laughing over glasses of wine. I stayed out of sight, circling the room like a predator. It wasn't long before I saw something that stopped me cold. Eric wasn't just a man. He was the man our CEO. My head spun as realization hit me. This wasn't just an affair. This was calculated, manipulative. Sarah wasn't just betraying me. She was leveraging her affair to climb the corporate ladder. They leaned in close, talking in hushed tones. At one point, Eric slid a small box across the table. Sarah opened it, her face lighting up as she pulled out a diamond necklace. She kissed him passionately, right there in front of everyone. I wanted to storm over, to drag her out of that club and end this charade. But I stopped myself. If I made a scene, it would ruin me, not her. No, I needed something more, something undeniable. I stepped into the shadows and pulled out my phone, snapping photos of their cozy little dinner. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As I left the club, a new plan began to form in my mind. A plan that would make Sarah and Eric regret every decision they'd made. The drive home was a blur. My mind churned with anger, humiliation, and the icy determination to make Sarah and Eric pay for what they'd done. I spent the next few hours sifting through everything I'd gathered so far. The texts, the emails, the photos from the club. It was all damning, but I needed more. The following day, I met Dave again. I told him I needed a deeper dive into Sarah's digital footprint. Reluctantly, he agreed. "You're going full spy mode," he said. "Just be careful this doesn't backfire." Within 24 hours, Dave had pulled up a trove of information I hadn't even thought to look for. Sarah and Eric had been exchanging emails through a secret account. They weren't just talking about their affair. They were discussing company strategies, insider deals, and ways to sideline my career. "She's not just cheating on you, man," Dave said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "She's sabotaging you." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. There were even plans to oust me from my position under the guise of restructuring. Eric had joked in one email about promoting Sarah to soften the blow. It was no longer about saving my marriage or confronting Sarah. This was war. I reached out to a private investigator the next day. His name was Mike, and he came highly recommended. I handed him the evidence I already had and asked him to dig deeper, into Sarah, into Eric, into anything that could give me the upper hand. Mike worked fast. Within days, he had uncovered a tangled web of lies. Eric wasn't just having an affair with Sarah. He had a history of relationships with subordinates. There were rumors of hush money and NDAs. Mike even hinted at financial discrepancies in Eric's accounts, though he couldn't prove it. "Your wife is playing a dangerous game," Mike said, sliding a folder across the table. "And Eric? He's got skeletons in his closet that could bury him if the right people found out." I flipped through the folder, my pulse quickening. Inside were more photos, more emails, even a record of hotel receipts that linked Eric and Sarah to multiple rendezvous. "This is enough to burn them both," Mike said, leaning back in his chair. "The question is, how far are you willing to go?" I looked at him, my resolve hardening. "As far as it takes." I spent the next week carefully piecing together my plan. Every move had to be calculated, every step precise. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my life. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed to strike. The evidence against Sarah and Eric was damning, but I wanted their downfall to be public, irreversible, and humiliating. It was no longer enough to confront Sarah and demand an explanation. I needed to destroy their carefully crafted facades. The first step was to ensure I was legally and financially protected. I met with a ruthless divorce attorney, someone known for leaving no stone unturned. I handed over all the evidence I'd gathered. She reviewed it silently, then looked up at me with a sharp smile. "This will gut her," she said. "And if you play your cards right, you'll come out of this with everything." I nodded. "What about Eric?" Her smile widened. "Corporate scandals are like wildfire. Once this spreads, he'll be lucky to keep his reputation, let alone his position." Next, I contacted HR at my company anonymously, forwarding them the evidence of Eric's inappropriate relationship with Sarah. I made sure to include the emails discussing insider deals and their plans to push me out. It was a calculated move. I didn't want Eric to suspect me yet. I also leaked select portions of the emails to a trusted journalist I knew. Not the explicit details, just enough to hint at misconduct in the upper ranks of the company. By the time Monday rolled around, the cracks in their foundation were beginning to show. At home, I played my part perfectly. Sarah was still lying to my face, still sneaking off to her work meetings and texting Eric under the table. I smiled, cooked dinner, and acted like the oblivious husband she clearly thought I was. But then I started planting seeds. One night, as we sat on the couch, I casually mentioned a surprise work audit that was happening at the office. Apparently, they're cracking down on inappropriate relationships and financial irregularities, I said, keeping my tone light. Sarah's hand froze mid-text. She laughed nervously. "Wow, that's intense. You think anyone we know might get caught up in it?" I asked, watching her closely. She shrugged, but her eyes darted away. "I doubt it." The next day, I made sure to leave early for work, giving Sarah plenty of time to meet Eric without suspicion. But I didn't go to the office. Instead, I parked down the street and waited. Sure enough, within an hour, Eric's car pulled into our driveway. I stayed hidden as they entered the house together. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. Let them feel safe, I thought. Let them believe they're untouchable. This was the calm before the storm. Sitting in my car down the street from my own house, I watched as Eric and Sarah disappeared inside, laughing like teenagers sneaking around. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, but I reminded myself that patience was key. This wasn't the moment to strike. Not yet. I waited an hour, then two, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Finally, they emerged, disheveled and glowing with the smug satisfaction of people who thought they'd gotten away with something. Eric kissed Sarah on the cheek before driving off, and she returned to the house as if nothing had happened. That night, I uploaded the evidence Mike had collected, including photos, emails, and videos, to a secure cloud server. I created a series of anonymous emails, each addressed to key players, HR at my company, our board of directors, and the journalist I'd contacted earlier. But I wasn't just sending files. I was planning an event, a moment of reckoning that no one involved would ever forget. The opportunity came sooner than I'd expected. The following week, the company held a gala to celebrate its latest milestones. Sarah had been pestering me to attend, insisting it would look good for appearances. Of course, I knew why she really wanted to go. Eric would be there. I agreed, feigning enthusiasm. The night of the gala, I watched as Sarah transformed herself into a vision of elegance, her black dress hugging her figure and her smile radiant. She looked at me expectantly, as though we were a happy couple heading out for a night of celebration. Little did she know I'd arranged for her and Eric's worlds to come crashing down. The venue was a grand ballroom, filled with laughter, champagne, and the soft hum of a live orchestra. Sarah flitted around the room, charming colleagues and stealing glances at Eric when she thought I wasn't looking. I stayed close to the bar, biding my time. When the speeches began, I made my move. Using my phone, I triggered the first part of my plan. A mass email sent to everyone in attendance, including Eric and Sarah. It contained the emails, the texts, and a few select photos. Within minutes, the room was buzzing with whispers and gasps. People stared at their phones, then at Eric, whose face had turned ghostly pale. Sarah was oblivious at first, too focused on chatting with a group of executives. But then she noticed the stares, the murmurs, and finally, the fury in Eric's eyes as he stormed toward her. "What the hell did you do?" he hissed, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Sarah blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Eric shoved his phone into her hands. As she read, her face drained of color, and she turned to me. "You!" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You did this." I smiled, savoring the moment. "Careful, Sarah. People are watching." And they were. Dozens of colleagues, executives, and even the CEO's wife who looked like she wanted to tear both of them apart. "You destroyed us," Sarah hissed, her voice low but venomous. "No," I said calmly, stepping closer so only she could hear. "You destroyed us. I'm just making sure you and Eric get the recognition you deserve." As security arrived to escort Eric out and Sarah was left standing alone in the chaos, I walked away, my heart pounding with a mix of triumph and sorrow. The storm had only just begun. The aftermath of the gala was everything I had hoped for and more. By the time Sarah came home, it was well past midnight, and she looked like a ghost. Her makeup was smudged, her hair disheveled, and her eyes filled with panic. "How could you do this to me?" she screamed the moment she walked through the door. I was sitting calmly on the couch, a glass of whiskey in hand. "Do what, Sarah?" "Expose the truth. You've ruined my life," she yelled, her voice cracking. "Eric's been suspended. HR is investigating everything. Everyone at work knows." I set the glass down and stood, towering over her. "You ruined your life the moment you decided to lie, cheat, and humiliate me. Don't you dare pin this on me." She opened her mouth to argue but then hesitated. She must have realized that there was no way to spin this in her favor anymore. "This isn't over," she said finally, her tone venomous. "Oh, I know," I replied coldly. "Because tomorrow, I'm filing for divorce." Her face fell, but I wasn't done. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. With the evidence I have, you'll walk away with nothing. No house, no money, no dignity. And as for Eric, his career is over. Did you really think he'd keep his job after this?" Sarah stumbled back as if I'd slapped her. She stared at me for a long moment before turning and storming upstairs. The next morning, I followed through on my promise. My lawyer filed the paperwork, attaching every piece of evidence we had. By the afternoon, Sarah had been served. Meanwhile, Eric's scandal had spread like wildfire. The company issued a formal statement about the investigation, and rumors swirled that his wife had filed for divorce as well. The journalist I'd contacted published an expose on Eric's history of affairs and corruption, further tarnishing his reputation. As for Sarah, she tried to save face, but it was futile. Word had gotten out, and she was the subject of whispers and judgment everywhere she went. Her friends distanced themselves, and even her family stopped defending her. I, on the other hand, was just getting started. Sarah's humiliation wasn't limited to whispers and judgment. Over the next few days, I made sure her betrayal became a public spectacle. First, I mailed copies of the evidence, emails, photos, and receipts to her family. I included a letter explaining everything she had done, not out of spite but to ensure they knew the truth. Sarah's parents had always been vocal about their disapproval of me, but now the shoe was on the other foot. Then I made another call to Mike, the private investigator. He had uncovered more dirt on Eric, his misuse of company funds to pay for lavish gifts for Sarah, as well as a slush fund used to cover up previous affairs. I handed this information over to the journalist, who published a follow-up article. Eric's life was unraveling faster than I could have planned. He was fired, and his wife kicked him out of their mansion. His social media accounts were flooded with hate comments, and he quickly became a pariah in our industry. As for Sarah, her professional life took a hit as well. The emails I'd leaked painted her as complicit in Eric's schemes. HR launched a formal investigation into her conduct, and although they didn't fire her outright, she was reassigned to a dead-end role in another department. I watched all of this unfold from the sidelines, my satisfaction growing with every blow they suffered. But the real climax came a week later, when Sarah and I were scheduled to meet for a mediation session about the divorce. She showed up looking deflated, her once pristine confidence replaced by a nervous energy. "Was all of this necessary?" she asked as we sat across from each other, the mediator shuffling papers. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "You sabotaged our marriage, our finances, and my career for your selfish games. You don't get to decide what's necessary." She looked away, her jaw tightening. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "Not as much as you enjoyed sneaking around with Eric," I replied calmly. The mediator cleared her throat, trying to steer the conversation back to the task at hand. But I had already made my point. That session ended with Sarah agreeing to most of my terms. She knew she couldn't fight me, not with the evidence I had. When it was over, I walked out of the room with a lightness I hadn't felt in months. The chessboard was mine, and my opponents were out of moves. Just when I thought everything had settled, a twist emerged that threatened to upend my victory. 2 days after the mediation session, I received an anonymous tip. An envelope slid under my door. Inside were printed photos of Sarah and Eric together, but these were different. The timestamps showed they'd been meeting months earlier than I had suspected, during a time when Eric's company was negotiating a major merger. Accompanying the photos was a note. "You've only scratched the surface. Check the numbers. Follow the money." At first, I dismissed it as someone trying to stir the pot, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached out to Mike, who once again proved his worth. Over the next week, he connected the dots between Eric's financial discrepancies and the merger. It turned out Sarah had been feeding Eric confidential information from my work emails, details she would have had access to from our shared computer at home. This wasn't just infidelity. It was corporate espionage. Armed with this new evidence, I made another anonymous call to the journalist. Within days, another article dropped, this time exposing how Eric and Sarah's relationship had compromised the merger. The fallout was swift. The merger was canceled, and both companies announced internal investigations. Eric faced the possibility of legal action, and Sarah was officially terminated from her job. She came to the house that evening, pounding on the door until I let her in. "You're ruining my life," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "How much more do you want?"
Isterte her, unmovill.
"This isn't about what I want, Sarah. It's about what you deserve." She collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face. "I made a mistake," she sobbed. "I didn't think it would go this far." I crossed my arms, watching her crumble. "You didn't think at all. You played with people's lives, mine, Eric's wife, your colleagues, and now you're paying the price. Welcome to accountability." For the first time, she didn't argue. She didn't lash out. She simply sat there, defeated. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have nothing left." I didn't reply. I simply walked upstairs, leaving her to let herself out. After Sarah left that night, I didn't hear from her for weeks. The silence was deafening but welcome. It gave me the space to focus on reclaiming my life, my work, my friends, and even the hobbies I had set aside during our toxic marriage. But then, one morning, I received an unexpected call from Sarah's mother. "Jason," she said, her voice thick with concern. "It's Sarah. She's not doing well." I sighed, the weight of everything she'd done still fresh in my mind. "Why are you telling me this?" "She's lost her job, her reputation, and her friends," her mother continued, ignoring my tone. "She's staying with us now, but she won't leave her room. She barely eats. I know she hurt you, but she's still my daughter. Please, can you talk to her?" I wanted to say no. Every instinct in me screamed to walk away, to let her deal with the consequences of her choices. But something about her mother's voice, desperate, pleading, stopped me. "Fine," I said finally. "I'll come by this weekend." When I arrived at their house, Sarah looked like a shadow of herself. She was gaunt, her usually flawless hair unkempt, and her eyes dull. It was a stark contrast to the confident, calculating woman I had married. "What do you want?" she asked flatly when I entered her room. "I didn't come here for me," I replied. "Your mom asked me to talk to you." She laughed bitterly. "What's there to talk about? You've already destroyed me." "No, Sarah," I said, stepping closer. "You destroyed you. I just made sure everyone saw the truth." Her face twisted with anger, but she didn't argue. Instead, she slumped onto the bed, her head in her hands. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad," she whispered. "Then why did you do it?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Because I was scared. Scared of losing everything, scared of being ordinary. Eric promised me excitement, power, a life I thought I wanted. But it was all a lie." I shook my head, pity stirring in my chest despite everything. "You didn't need power or excitement, Sarah. You had loyalty, love, and a home. You threw it all away for something shallow." For the first time, she didn't snap back or try to deflect. She just nodded, broken. "Do you hate me?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I don't forgive you. Not yet." I left her there, hoping she'd finally understand the depth of the damage she'd caused. While Sarah wallowed in her misery, Eric's life was crumbling even faster. The fallout from the canceled merger had triggered a full-scale audit of his financial dealings. It didn't take long for the investigators to uncover a treasure trove of fraudulent activities, from embezzlement to tax evasion. The day his arrest hit the news, I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. The same man who had so arrogantly flaunted his affair with my wife was now being led away in handcuffs, his face plastered across every major news outlet. For Sarah, Eric's downfall was the final nail in the coffin. She'd hitched her wagon to his rising star, and now she was left with nothing but the wreckage of her own life. I received an email from her not long after, the subject line simply reading, "I'm sorry, Jason. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. I'm sorry for everything. For lying, cheating, and betraying you in ways you didn't deserve. I've lost everything, and I know it's my own fault. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll understand that I never meant to hurt you the way I did. I wish I could undo it all, but I can't. All I can do is say I'm sorry and hope you find happiness, even if it's without me. Sarah." I stared at the email for a long time, my emotions conflicting. Her apology felt hollow, too little too late. But at the same time, it felt like the closure I needed. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I focused on moving forward. My divorce attorney informed me that everything was proceeding smoothly. Sarah had agreed to all the terms, likely because she knew she didn't have a leg to stand on. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The storm was over and I was ready to rebuild. With the divorce finalized and Sarah out of my life for good, I began to focus on myself for the first time in years. The house, once a painful reminder of my failed marriage, became my sanctuary. I cleared out every trace of Sarah, her clothes, her photos, even the fancy wine glasses she insisted on buying. The emptiness didn't feel lonely. It felt liberating. I threw myself into my work, determined to repair my professional reputation. The HR investigation had exposed Eric's schemes, and the board not only reinstated my position but also issued a public statement exonerating me of any involvement in the fiasco. Colleagues who had kept their distance during the scandal now approached me with apologies and support. It felt good to be respected again, to reclaim the dignity Sarah and Eric had tried to strip away. Outside of work, I reconnected with old friends, people I had neglected during my marriage. They welcomed me back without hesitation, dragging me to dinners, hikes, and even the occasional happy hour. One evening, during a particularly rowdy game night, my best friend Mark pulled me aside. "You look lighter," he said, studying me with a grin. I laughed, probably because I dropped about 130 pounds of dead weight. Mark chuckled, clinking his beer against mine. "Here's to new beginnings, man. You deserve it." Despite the progress, there were moments of lingering anger and sadness, memories that would surface unexpectedly, like ghosts haunting the edges of my newfound peace. But each day, those feelings faded a little more. I even started dating again, cautiously at first. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but it felt good to remind myself that I could be happy with someone who valued me. And for the first time in a long time, I was genuinely optimistic about the future. Months passed, and life began to feel normal again. Better, even. I had rebuilt my career, strengthened old friendships, and rediscovered who I was outside of my marriage. But as much as I tried to move on, I couldn't help but keep tabs on Sarah and Eric's unraveling lives. Eric's trial was the talk of the town. The evidence against him was overwhelming, thanks in part to the documentation I had anonymously provided. Watching the coverage, I couldn't suppress a grim smile when he was convicted of embezzlement and fraud. He was sentenced to several years in prison, his once pristine reputation permanently destroyed. As for Sarah, she had become a pariah. Word of her affair and involvement in Eric's schemes had spread beyond the workplace, seeping into every corner of her social circles. Her once loyal friends had abandoned her, and she struggled to find work. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she was living in a tiny apartment and working a low-paying retail job just to make ends meet. I didn't feel sorry for her, not after everything she'd done, but I did feel satisfied. Justice had been served. The final piece of closure came one evening when I received a call from Eric's wife, Claire. We hadn't spoken before, but she wasted no time thanking me. "You don't know how much your actions meant to me," she said. "You gave me the truth when everyone else was content to lie. And now, I'm finally free of him." "I just did what I had to do," I replied. "Well, it mattered," she said firmly. "If you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." As I hung up, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. Sarah and Eric had tried to tear me down, but instead, they had destroyed themselves. And in the process, I had gained something far more valuable than revenge: clarity, strength, and a fresh start. I poured myself a drink and stepped onto the balcony, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was truly at peace. The final chapter of this saga was one I hadn't anticipated: forgiveness. Not for Sarah or Eric, but for myself. For so long, I had blamed myself for not seeing the signs sooner, for trusting too much, for not being enough to keep Sarah loyal. But as time passed, I realized that none of it was my fault. The betrayal said everything about who they were and nothing about me. I began to let go of the anger and bitterness. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But each small step forward felt like a victory. Another chain broken, another weight lifted. One evening, as I was packing up the last of Sarah's belongings to donate, I found an old photo of us. We were young and happy, smiling on a beach during our honeymoon. I stared at it for a long time before placing it in a box. That chapter of my life was over, and I was ready to write a new one. The house, once filled with memories of Sarah, had transformed into my own space. I painted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and even adopted a dog, a goofy golden retriever named Max who quickly became my constant companion. Work thrived, friendships deepened, and I found joy in the little things. A weekend hike, a good book, a quiet evening with Max. And then there was Claire. We started as acquaintances bound by shared betrayal, but over time, we became friends. She was sharp, kind, and resilient in ways that reminded me of the strength I'd rediscovered in myself. We didn't rush anything, but there was an undeniable connection between us. One night, after a long dinner filled with laughter and stories, she looked at me and said, "You're not the same person I heard about when this all started." I smiled. "Neither are you." The future wasn't something I feared anymore. It was something I welcomed. A blank canvas waiting to be filled with new experiences, new people, and new opportunities. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching Max chase fireflies in the yard, I raised a glass to the past. Not to mourn it, but to honor the lessons it had taught me. I had survived the betrayal, exacted justice, and come out stronger. The revenge had been satisfying, yes, but the real victory was in the life I had rebuilt. And that, I realized, was the sweetest revenge of all.